The fact that the Federal Reserve, for example, in the US doubled the size of its book, meaning they fabricated more money in the months that followed March 2020 than in the entire set of years from 2008 up to 2020. Like, they doubled the amount of fabrication of money, just like that. Everyone bought this story that they were helping the real economy. You are basically saying that you're fighting an inflation that you can't beat.
It's a little disturbing, but it's to the point, and you talk about a real crisis that's coming up very soon, but also you do deliver some hope, because there is a way, kind of like you alluded to earlier, Wall Street style, where you can actually learn how to benefit from what's coming up as looks like an energy crisis.
You can't change my electricity bill. You can't really change how much I can afford in sort of my basket of groceries each week. But somehow you're saying that you're going to keep on fighting inflation until you can.
We stick it to our customers, we stick it to the other traders, we stick it to anybody we can to jack up our P&L. This is just common, and that's how I learned what Wall Street was all about.
It was just how people were, how the managing partners acted, not to the people in the firms, but they're just general callous about people on the outside of the firms. Like it didn't even matter. I value my freedom more than I value doing something for money, which is very different than having money. I value my ability to say, that doesn't work for me.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go? This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. Nomi Prins, the renowned investigative journalist, international speaker, financial expert, and best-selling author. You were previously the managing director at Goldman Sachs and a strategist at Lehman Brothers and Chase Manhattan Bank. Since then, you've written 7 best-selling books, including Collusion, How Central Bankers Rigged the World, and All the President's Bankers, The Hidden Alliances That Drive American Power. You've been featured as a TV commentator on the BBC, CNN, and Fox, while your work has been published in the New York Times, Forbes, and The Guardian. Your latest book, Permanent Distortion, How the Financial Markets Abandoned the Real Economy Forever, addresses the increasing divide between the financial markets and the real economy, which began with the 2008 crisis, has been made worse by the money printing that followed the pandemic. You believe that the central banks are money-creating machines that are encouraging riskier and bigger bubbles than ever before, leaving the vast majority of us in a permanent financial dystopia. Nomi, welcome back to London Real.
Thank you so much, Brian. It really is good to be back here.
It's been years. It's great to have you here, and I can't wait to jump into this. But before we get started, I just want to mention that you and I have just recorded a special, almost distressing video, actually, about an upcoming crisis and a financial opportunity that's not going to be available on YouTube or any of our social media channels. If anybody wants to watch that and they need to go see it, they can go to londonreal.tv/Nomi, that's N-O-M-I, but it's only available for a limited time only, so they should check it out. I will say it is a bit distressing, but it's also an incredible way to position yourself for financial gain with this upcoming crisis we see with energy. I'll probably not give any more details right now, but I would say go to londonreal.tv/Nomi to check that out. Let's jump in here. I think the last time I saw you, we were in London, and we were all out having dinner with Robert Kiyosaki. And I think it was in the middle of dinner, he said, the reason I like Nomi is because she used to be on the inside of Wall Street. This is before you became a journalist and a whistleblower. And so she really understands what's going on and all the funny games that are being played inside there. And maybe we start with that. Can you tell me how your access, I mean, one of the youngest MDs at Goldman Sachs, has given you this unique perspective on the world?
Yeah, well, I was involved in banking. I mean, even here as a senior managing director at Bear Stearns in London, just over at Canary Wharf decades ago, as well as an MD at Goldman Sachs, as you mentioned, and throughout all my history, all my experience on Wall Street, I was very close to all sorts of new innovations and basically how to remanufacture securities and to move money and to just look at really exotic, complex types of trades, of transactions. And it was my job to look at the numbers behind them and to run teams that looked at the numbers behind them. But what was really interesting beyond the numbers, and I am a numbers person, it was just how people were, how the managing partners acted, not to the people in the firms, but they're just general callous about people on the outside of the firms. Like it didn't even matter. And I think that was the one thing where I knew how to make money. I knew how to create analytics. I knew how to follow numbers. But that disconnect to just humanity was something that really struck me as I was working, and one of the reasons why I quit. But also, just looking back now, I understand the psychology of Wall Street. So I feel like all of those experiences, they gave me the ability to look at even the news today, to look at financial news, business media, what analysts are saying on Wall Street even today, and understand that their real motivation ultimately is to have a lot of cheap money, to be able to do what they want with it in terms of, again, complex security creation, putting it in markets, etc. And again, not to care what the ramifications could be of those types of risky strategies. I mean, they just truly don't care.
Yeah, I mean, I got a real baptism by fire of this. It was 1993. I moved from MIT to Wall Street. I was 22 years old, and I got on the trading floor, and I just got taught, the way you do business. Mm-hmm. And that is that we stick it to our customers, we stick it to the other traders, we stick it to anybody we can mm-hmm. to jack up our P&L. Mm-hmm. And it was just like walking into like an abusive or dysfunctional family or relationship where it's like, this is just common. And mm-hmm. that's how I learned mm-hmm. what Wall Street was all about. They didn't teach this at the MIT Sloan School of Management. It wasn't in a book, but that's just the culture there. And it's been around for probably, I guess 100 years, but maybe, 50 years, and I don't know if it's ever going to change, but it's a mentality that then pervades the whole financial industry around the globe. And it's probably not going to change anytime soon.
No, I mean, I don't think so. And the difference is that when you and I were working in the financial industry, you didn't have all this excess sort of money sloshing around like from central banks and stuff the same way that banks actually do today, whether it's direct or indirect. And so there was a sense that it wasn't us against them thing, people in the system versus everybody else, but you didn't quite have as much help, or if your positions were screwed, you kind of had to, what we called, eat them. I mean, I'm sure you know those scenarios. So you tried not to. You tried to basically bring them off onto other people or other investors. But at the end of the day, they were still, the losses that you had to take if there were losses to be taken. And that all kind of changed in the financial crisis of 2008. I mean, just to get a teeny bit off topic here, right? You're talking about 1993 and basically what you saw in that moment. I was working at Bear Stearns over at Canary Wharf, and I remember there was a position that the New York head office wanted to get rid of. Just a position lying around somebody's trading book that just was, gushing, hemorrhaging money. I was like, go find an international central bank. Just figure out a way to make it look good and just sell it to them. And that was basically one of the things that my group was responsible for trying to do, is to create analytics that made something look better than it actually was for the team, which was, the Bear Stearns at the time. And I remember we did sell it, or the salespeople did sell it, and about 2 weeks later, the central bank dials back and is like, we can't get rid of this thing. It's eating into our books. It's just hemorrhaging. Can you take it back? And, the response from the trading desk was like, we're not taking it back. Basically you bought it, you own it. And that, again, that mentality It was not unique at all there. I mean, the same thing happened at Goldman with different positions, etc. That's just something that has not changed. It's just, again, today, there's just more of a cushion being provided to these positions and to these companies.
So if it gets really bad, you might get bailed out by someone.
Absolutely. I mean, the financial crisis of 2008 was really bad. Even in 2019, before the pandemic, I mean, one of the things that was going on was the Fed was starting to raise rates, other central banks were raising rates into 2019, and then all of a sudden, in the middle of 2019, they started cutting rates. Why? Not because of anything in the economy, though that's kind of the excuse that they use. We're helping the economy, we'll loosen liquidity. It was because Wall Street was complaining because their own corporate customers weren't trusting each other and they weren't trusting the banks. And so that idea of lending money to their own large blue chip customers was a little bit on edge. So they wanted money to be looser. And as a result, that is what happened. And that was before the pandemic, where everything just went haywire anyway, post that moment. But it started with Wall Street wanting yet more help.
Right. And then the pandemic came. So I saw you before that when you were in the studio.
Yeah.
And then all of that happened.
Yeah.
And again, for someone like you that's been studying the markets and writing books about them and trading them, that must have been wild for you to witness. And maybe what happened isn't what you expected to happen, or didn't. I know that I was locked up and just ready for the stock markets to fall down. I was going to board up my house. And then they bounced right back. And I was like, wow, this is just fascinating. And I never saw this coming. Did you? And then what did you make of what happened? And then, you know, post that, how does that lead into permanent distortion?
Yeah, so I mean, I never thought that once that sort of genie was out of the bottle of central banks being able to just, like, you know, help bail out Wall Street and other international financial centers around the world, and had since 2008 through 2019 in different ways. When the pandemic hit, it was clear to me that they were going to step in and do something. Why? Because they could. Because they could create money. And when money was basically, you know, choked because the economies were all shut down, they didn't have that constraint. You know, that they could, the amount that they created, the fact that the Federal Reserve, for example, in the U.S. doubled the size of its book, meaning they fabricated more money in the months that followed March 2020 than in the entire set of years from 2008 up to 2020. Like, they doubled the amount of fabrication of money, just like that. And it was like, wow, if actual real people could just do that all the time, what a weird world it would be. But when the Fed does that, you know, and the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, when they all do that under the guise of helping the economy, what was fascinating to me was not as much that they were doing it. It was how much they did it. Yes, it was just massive. But also that everyone bought this story that they were helping the real economy. And like you said, what we saw was markets just zoom up really, really quickly while economies were still closed.
Yeah. And
yet the narrative remained and still remains, even though they've changed some of what they're doing. They're now the Fed is raising rates, and they're supposedly reducing some of that cushion to the markets. But the reality is they're not reducing much of the cushion very quickly anyway. And yet we're supposed to believe now this is helping the economy. It could be painful a little bit, but it's helping the economy. So this idea, this false narrative that the Fed or the central banks are some sort of like economic heroes for the working class or Main Street, that's the part that, you know, when I think about the term permanent distortion, when I selected those terms specifically to describe that, the distorted effect of what's happening in markets versus what's happening to real people every day on the street in their homes, you know, paying their bills, going to work, has just become so out of whack that it's not just a reaction to an emergency. It is, in fact, a permanent condition.
Yeah. And that's why I love this term. And I've never heard anyone coin it before until you have here with the book. But this permanent distortion, because you always hear biggest bull market of our generation. And then you ask the average person, did you make any money off that? Nope. Are you struggling? Yeah, I got real problems. And now we're looking down the barrel of inflation, power outages, energy crises. And your average person in the real economy, as you say, is not benefiting from this other, you know, financial market economy. And this is this distortion that you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. And all of those price increases, you know, particularly in energy and food, fertilizer, you know, different things that impact people's real home budgets like every single day, decisions as to what to eat and when, and whether they can go so far to work or not. All of the decisions that have to be made on the basis of what they make not matching what things cost is very real. I mean, those are experiences that people have on a regular basis. And so when you see the market going up dramatically, or even when you see it going down a bit because it's shaky, because the Fed and other central banks might increase the cost of the availability of money to the markets, it doesn't change the fact that they're not getting better either way. They're not getting better when the markets are zooming up. They're not getting better when the markets are choppy and going down because rates are rising. They're not actually doing better regardless of what these central banks do. And yet again, this narrative, and this is why I wrote that book. I mean, I wrote, the last book I wrote, which was Collusion, How Central Banks Rigged the World. They did. They basically rigged it on behalf of the financial markets and on behalf of the lack of transparency as to what things actually should cost and should be valued at. But then they just went way more steps in the wake of the pandemic, and they used the excuse that they were helping people when no one was really helped by this policy. And now their new policy is supposed to, again, sort of stabilize inflation. Well, last time I checked, the Fed cannot reduce your electricity bill. They can't find oil, sort of anywhere. They're not about that. They're not about creating a pipeline or doing anything. They can't reduce the cost of food. They can't reduce world hunger. There's nothing they can do. And yeah, you got Jerome Powell and all these central bank leaders talking about how they're going to fight inflation to help people. And it's just like, who out there really thinks they're being helped by these institutions? And yet, the news, the financial news, basically hang on what these people say.
Right, right. And this is a great point you make in the book, is that some of the major components of inflation, there's nothing that the central banks can do about it. And yet they're the ones that are telling us that we got you, we're going to protect you, we're going to jack up these rates to slow down this economy, to drop the inflation, when I think even normal people think that doesn't sound right. And again,
I remember I was in a cab in New York City, going to New York City from JFK when they had raised rates for the first time, the Fed, in March of this year. And this cab driver, he's driving me in, and we're chatting, and he's kind of like, oh, what do you do? And I say, I'm an economist. And normally that just stops the conversation, right? I mean, that's just like, no one, like, what? Like, I'm just going to fall asleep. Yeah, no. And usually I almost think I'm saying that because it's like, I just had this long flight, I just want to get to my hotel or whatever. But he literally turns around while we're driving into the city. He turns around, and he's like, you tell me this. You tell me this. How is whatever they're doing up there, referring to Washington, the Fed, whatever he was hearing, how is them raising the cost of my mortgage helping me? I don't get it. And at the time, when we talked about inflation rising later on in the year, gas prices were already creeping up. It's just the Fed didn't particularly notice, and they called inflation transitory. And then all of a sudden, now they're like, inflation is real, and we can do something about it, even though, again, we can't do anything about fuel prices or about food. And so real people are impacted by these central banks trying to reverse the sort of artificial effect of what they did along the way and along these years, but in a way that hurts real people as opposed to helps them. And why should they be allowed to even say, and I'm speaking specifically about Jerome Powell here, you might feel a little pain while we do this. We don't elect these people. No one gets to vote for the head of the Federal Reserve or the head of the European Central Bank or the head of the Bank of England. They're just like there. Yet what they do has such a real impact and an outsized impact on the negative side for real people, and doesn't help them on the positive side, i.e. really in fighting inflation. But ultimately still provides a very large cushion to the financial industry.
Right, right. And so just to kind of finish up on inflation, what should have been done, and why did this seem to sneak up on us from out of nowhere? Because we weren't talking about inflation last year, and then in the last 4 to 6 months, it's what everyone's talking about now, headline news. I do feel like the public is better educated now about a lot of things now, monetary policy, this kind of thing. But what should they have done, or what should have been done sooner to stop this from happening?
Well, when the Fed and other central banks created such a just deluge of fabricated money in the wake of the pandemic, and they connected it, and governments connected it, and headlines connected it to this idea of helping the economy, that was very much a just misconception that was just perpetuated, right? I mean, yes, putting some money into the system, allowing banks to continue to potentially make loans because certain businesses needed them because they had to be closed through no fault of their own. Yes, there was certainly some help in that. But not to the extent of these central banks effectively manufacturing out of nowhere more money in a few months than they had basically in all of their existence in such a short period of time at that moment. Yes, the pandemic was big. Yes, shutting down economies was horrible for many people. And yes, we could talk all day long about, sort of the health-related aspects of all of that. But on the economic side, that's what happened. And so what they should have done, again, is not create so much. Not promote the narrative that they were doing anything to help the real economy, because even then they weren't. I mean, yes, governments were creating fiscal stimulus. There was checks going out in the UK, in the US, and so forth, and that could have helped people or companies sort of get through. But the central banks weren't really the ones helping them. And so that was a problem. The other problem was they had no exit plan. There was no clear communication that said, we're going to dump trillions of dollars somehow into the markets, through debt, whatever, to help. But we don't know how long it's going to be there. We don't have any sort of strategy as to just something where we can dial it back before there is a real crisis. There was no conversation then, having learned after the financial crisis of 2008 that there was no exit plan then. So just this idea to sort of turn on financial spigots created this distortion between the market zooming up and ordinary people being left behind, even in the wake of economies being shut down. So that was wrong. The other thing was, even in the situation now with inflation, and not too long ago they considered inflation transitory. And then all of a sudden what happened, I think, was that gas prices were up by so much. And that's a very sort of politically harsh thing for officials that get elected to actually deal with. And all of a sudden, it's like, look, you guys got to do something about this. CPI, the basic consumer price inflation figures and the similar inflations throughout the world in terms of how they're computed, all of these numbers are going up. All these numbers are going higher. How can you guys just not notice this? And aren't you supposed to be the arbiters of price stability? Do something. And all of the central banks, besides the People's Bank of China, who've just ignored all of this, and they're continuing to sort of float their economy and try to come out of a low growth situation, and are continuing to close places and reopen and close and reopen. With the exception of that large central bank, they've all just sort of fallen into line. Even the European Central Bank recently, with raising rates by 75 basis points to flight inflation. So again, what's wrong in that? You are basically saying that you're fighting an inflation that you can't beat. Because you can't change my electricity bill. Right. Yet you're saying you can. You can't really change how much I can afford in sort of my basket of groceries each week. But somehow you're saying that you're going to keep on fighting inflation until you can. So I think the biggest problem with central banks, not even worrying about what monetary policy literally is, but just even in the narrative, just even in the fact that they're in the headlines, that we're having this conversation. The biggest problem is that they're lying about what they can do, and they're hurting people in the process when markets go up, when markets come back down, because ultimately they can no longer affect the real economy like they maybe thought they could have decades ago.
Right. Okay, well, you mentioned energy, and I got to ask you about it. And again, we have just actually recorded a special video where you go deep on basically upcoming serious energy crisis that I hope I'm not speaking out of school, but you're calling it Enron 2.0. Mm-hmm. And I remember when Enron failed back in the day and took down you know, a big chunk of the stock market along with it. And you're saying we're facing a very, very serious crisis coming up. We've recorded a separate video. It's not going to be available on YouTube or our social media channels, but people here can go watch it at londonreal.tv/Nomi. That's Nomi. It's a bit distressing, but the good news is that you also have a financial strategy based on all of your years on Wall Street, where actually people can not only protect themselves, but also profit from something that's about to happen, and it's coming up very soon. So I just say to everybody, click the link and go watch it. It's not available for very long. Without getting into maybe some of the things that we talked about there in detail, talk to me about energy. You know, we're here in the UK, so that means we're very close to Ukraine, Russia, Germany. All of these people are dealing with crises. I know you've been up and down the country talking to real people on the streets about worried about their electricity bills, how they're going to stay warm this winter. I'm thinking about my own family and what we're going to have to deal with. And we live on an island here, but I mean, the U.S. has also got real issues as well. And you got power outages in California. So what do you tell people when they ask you about what's going to happen with energy?
So I've never been someone, I mean, despite the titles of my books, I never want to be that person that scares people. I want to explain what's going on so that they can actually do something about their situation. Now, in the case of energy prices, what I've heard from a lot of people, particularly in the UK, and this is not dissimilar in the United States, is that, well, we don't get a lot of our natural gas from Russia, like, for example, Germany does. So how come our bills have basically quadrupled, our electricity bills, in the past year? Like, how did that happen? Like, we understand there's a supply thing, there's Ukraine, there's Russia, there's pipelines that aren't sort of on, but why is it so bad? And another thing is, we have gone in the UK to a lot of renewable energy outside of natural gas that powers electricity. So how come those prices are higher too? And the reality is, and this is something that's really important for people to understand, and this is why the energy crisis is more than just how much it costs to heat your homes or your businesses. Because the world market, and this ties back to Wall Street, and this ties back to international central banks and traders, international private banks, institutions, traders, hedge funds, private equity funds, is that regardless of what happens in reality, the perception that the cost is higher means people trade in that industry, in the financial industry, those items higher than they should even be, based on supply and demand, and that creates this elevating effect. So the real person has to pay for the reality of that supply versus demand difference, and also for the sort of financial wizardry that's happening in addition that's making it worse. And so when I look at strategies for that, it's not to say that it's a way to necessarily cut the cost of your electric bill if it's related to natural gas, and natural gas prices are rising, and even though you can't do anything about it, there's a world out there that's causing them to continue to rise for multiple reasons. But what I can say is that there are ways from at least an investment standpoint to sort of stay ahead of that, to basically hedge the sort of hemorrhaging cost in your budget in order to sort of invest in a way that helps. It doesn't mean, look, I mean, if I could tell every pub that's looking at potentially closing its doors, as so many are in the UK, because electricity prices, heating prices could skyrocket by so much this winter, to just do this little investment scheme and you'll be fine. If I could explain it in such a way that they had the ability to do it, I actually would, because that's what Wall Street does. They hedge the rising cost of things by trading into it or trading around it or finding a strategy that works. And so from my perspective, that's what I kind of want to share with people. And you know, you mentioned I was up and down the country. I was in Birmingham, actually at a pub in the jewelry quarter, which I did not know, but it's one of the largest exporters of jewelry in between Europe and the UK, throughout the world. And they created the technology for a lot of jewelry back in the Industrial Revolution. So I've been there a long time. And I'm in a pub, and I'm sort of one of the very old ones, old Victorian pub. And there were these two 18-year-olds who were sitting on they were 18, they were able to drink, as they told us. But we were sitting drinking, and they were talking about energy prices, because one of them worked for a place down the road that literally was 2 days away from having to close because specifically of higher bills. And that is very real.
Yeah, and you cover, I think, some of these strategies on this video that we went through, which is LondonReal.tv/Nomi. There's a term I think you mentioned in your book, which is greedflation, which is this kind of term where maybe you just described it there, maybe it's slightly different, where you hear the price of something going up, but also it seems to get pushed even more by businesses, by Wall Street, to where, like you said, someone in America is like, wait a second, something's 4x higher. Like, even I know something that's happening over there shouldn't be affecting this here. So maybe explain to people kind of what happens, because I think a lot of people in this country are feeling that too. Like, okay, we understand there's a crisis, but it feels overdone. So how does something like that get overdone?
Right. So part of, especially in something like energy or food, part of any of the price has to do with supply and demand, right? So if there is a political or a war-like turmoil or a weather-related condition or something happens that basically, or a pandemic that jolts that relationship between supply and demand, it's going to distort a price anyway. It's going to create more demand for a good, anything, food, energy, that's not as readily available is going to cause that price to go up. And that's kind of basic supply and demand in economics, and that's all very wonky. But where Wall Street comes in, where the financial industry comes in, where trading comes in, where sort of the global markets come in, is that idea of seeing that prices are going up for a real actual reason, and we're going to pile into those prices from a trading perspective, because we're just going to ride this wave that's out there anyway. So if all of the news is talking about gas prices going up, then let's sort of move in and push those related companies, push the prices up by more, because we've got all this basically cheap money to be able to do that with, and we can sort of get out when we decide that profit's enough. And sometimes, like more recently, actual gas prices, fuel prices in the United States have come down a bit. Partly that's because people have been unwinding some of those positions. It's not necessarily like everything just changed and all of a sudden there's like 40% more fuel for gasoline available in the last 2 months. That's not it. It's just that money behind those real effects goes somewhere else, as well as whatever happens with the real effect. And that's where this greedflation comes in, because it's really the sort of jumping on the bandwagon of things that are already happening. There's already a squeeze, there's already a mismatch between what's being supplied or what's being transported and what people need. But this extra kind of price appreciation is often because of the global markets being global financial markets and pushing some of that price up by more.
Right. You also go on and talk about, in the book, kind of infrastructure spending as well. And like, I know something was passed in the U.S. recently, and it was like a bill that was designed to combat inflation. I forgot the name of it.
It was called the Inflation Reduction Act,
right.
Yes.
Which most people thought was just the most ridiculous thing, because it was only going to do everything but push inflation up. Maybe speak on that, a little briefly. How do you see something like that, and how does that feed into some of the things that you talk about in the book?
So one of the things I do talk about in the book, in the chapter where I address inflation and infrastructure and inequality, the 3 I's, I actually address them all in one chapter. And I do that because they're related. Now, infrastructure in general, building the technologies, the physical constructs that are needed to basically allow populations to move from A to B, to live in different places, to sort of expand their general horizons. Like, all of that stuff I think is good. I loved riding the fast train when I was traveling a number of years back from Beijing to Shanghai, because the airport was closed for whatever the reason it does often there in Shanghai, and I needed to get from point A to B, and I took a fast train. It was really, really fast. And we don't have anything like that in the United States. So the idea of like developing technologies and infrastructure to be able to have that happen, I think is a very positive thing. I mean, I think it can ultimately grow the foundation of an economy in a really positive way. But what happens is when money is appropriated too quickly, and the financial industry gets involved and sort of pushes the value of some of the companies or the technologies that might be involved up by more than they should be valued at, even given the fact that they're creating a growing infrastructure, a growing economy, that's when these distortions kind of come into play as well, because the idea of money is basically getting ahead of the reality of that money being spent to build and create and innovate in a sort of more organic way, which I think is more stabilizing for an economy. So I always believe that, if the government, for example, in that case, the Inflation Reduction Act, and I think I said in a number of places publicly that it does not actually reduce inflation, but there were pieces of it that allowed for the funding of certain technologies, for example, in the energy space, that if those are built, will ultimately help with energy solutions. But again, that you have to basically look at a timeline of things being developed and people being involved and materials being available and needed and everything else. So I'm very much a realist when it comes to just life. And I do believe that when there's money available and it's organically created and used, and there's strategies and things are built and people use them, and it makes our lives better in multiple different ways, that's a positive thing. But when too much money chases too quickly items that might not necessarily do that or might not have an actual plan to getting there, that's when we have more sort of distortions created.
There's a line that came from you, and you said, the reality is that money, like a virus, will always seek the easiest way to reproduce itself. I've never heard anyone say that, but what do you mean by that, Nomi?
So I wrote the book in the wake of the pandemic, so the idea of virus was obviously forefront in my mind and in the mind of everyone in the world, I think, at the time. But when I thought about money and just the flow of money, that money doesn't have patience, right? Just like a virus doesn't necessarily have patience. It's just going to go from host to host, and it's going to do what it's going to do as fast as it can. And it's sort of the same thing with money, and particularly when it's driven by central banks fabricating it out of nowhere and by the financial community using it as quickly as it can to basically reproduce itself and then go away and do something else. So you're talking about infrastructure. If money is just basically created and there's no plan as to how it's going to ultimately play out for creating lasting pieces of the economy, then it's just used to go from one financial asset to another financial asset, sometimes maybe at the same time. And in that way, anyone who's involved makes money, right? Money makes money. The larger institutions profit. The people that are participating in the financial markets buy the most, profit the most. And that accelerates that whole thing. Like a virus, it just accelerates.
Yeah, God, that's a little scary to think about. Because if money gets thrown the wrong way, if it's cheap money, if it's being pushed here or there, not for maybe a natural reason or a Adam Smith invisible hand reason, then not only will it just be misappropriated for that point in time, it could create entire new industries, systems. Maybe that's what Wall Street is in itself, where it's this own beast with almost its own, intelligence that goes on to create more, because that's what it does. And then when it attracts more money, it attracts more talent, and the talent's good at making more of that money. I guess that's what you're talking about. That can get a little dark.
No,
right?
but that's exactly how I see it. Is there's nothing necessarily wrong with making money, right? And there's nothing wrong with sort of working and investing and saving and producing and enjoying so the benefits in life that money can provide. It's that unmooring of that basic relationship to this external sort of source of inflating money for just a small little echelon of society and of the markets, and therefore creating that sort of larger distortion between the reality of what money that is actually produced can do and money that's just fabricated out of nowhere creates.
Yeah, and that's this distortion that you're talking about.
Right.
You also said once that the earth may spin on its axis, but the world revolves around money. And that means, a lot of people don't always think about this, is that populism, nationalism, isolationism, corruption, trade wars, military wars, health crisis, inequality, economic hardship, they're all connected to money. And maybe I think a lot of people don't see that sometimes.
Yeah, because like anyone today watching here, you got your own issues in your own life. You've got your own sort of basic budgets or desires for the future. I mean, you're basically, we focus oftentimes on ourselves. I mean, that is a reality, and we also can help other people and all of that, but there's that base kind of survival instinct that we have, you know, ourselves, our families, and then so it goes out from there. And one of the things that I believe has happened as a result of this particular phase that we're in of permanent distortion, where central banks have just gone so just crazy off the rails in terms of fabricating money. Now for a minute they're trying to say, well, you know, we'll try to stop inflation now, but is that we have had so much additional unrest in the world in terms of civil unrest. One of the stats that I have in my book is that in 2019, before the pandemic, before this additional excess of money was created to basically dislocate the economy from the markets by more, it was the year of the most civil uprisings in the world ever. And we're talking about comparing that to, you know, things like, you know, the Roman invasion, and there's all sorts of things over time. But in terms of the number of spots, the number of topics, developing countries, etc., throughout the world, there was more events of civil unrest than there had been historically beforehand. And then, of course, we had the pandemic, and sort of no one was doing very much of anything, and that sort of put a little bit of a cap on that. But one of the reasons I think that happened, and one of the reasons that politically countries are swinging from left to right, you know, conservative to liberal. I mean, there was a lot of political revolving doors happening. Whoever was in power was pretty much going to basically be kicked out at the next election. And that's because people in general are so economically like strangled that they didn't like whoever was in office. They just wanted somebody else. And so that revolving door of, you know, left, right, conservative, liberal, and it doesn't even matter what you call it in whatever country, but that idea of that switch, we just want someone else, that accelerated. So all of these things I think accelerated because people in general were just facing, and still are, you know, this condition of just being, of just watching markets, of watching what politicians say, whatever party, of just watching what's going on around them that's being driven by ultimately a fabrication of what was $41 trillion worth of just money out of nowhere from all the central banks in the world over this time period, and just feeling really disconnected for very good reason from all of that stuff. And when you're disconnected from what you are being told is what's happening around you, like the markets are going up or like these positive things are happening outside of like your own purview, it makes you feel very angry. It makes you not want your politicians. It makes you not want your country. It makes you want to just protect yourself. So even that idea of nationalism, you want to end trade wars. I mean, that's all about sort of the political, you know, story that's attached to just protecting your family, your home, right, and whatever that means.
Right. And that probably goes into another great line where you said money doesn't just drive a wedge between different classes, races, genders, and countries. You say it is the wedge. That's kind of heavy to think about. Like you're saying, it's actually that does it.
Yeah.
Now maybe people can't express that. Maybe they don't always feel that. But ultimately, it does come down to money.
Yeah. It does, and money and not class. And the way you actually read that line, Brian, I actually hear more from the words I wrote by the way you just said that. So thank you for that. So what I mean is that going back to that idea that money is a virus, that money is basically a sort of organism that is in the way of the real economy, most people's experiences, and...
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.